Back door's open.
Hey, I got someone in the back!
Sir. One back, one back.
Give him a cuffs.
There is a bedroom in Will County, Illinois that no one who entered it that night will ever forget. The walls were pale, the bed sheets were soft, and on that bed, covered in wounds that no human being should ever have to count, lay a 6-year-old boy named Waddy. He was not moving. He had not moved in some time. When the first officers pushed through the door and swept their flashlights across the room, they stopped. Some of them have never talked publicly about what they saw. They do not have to. The body camera footage tells everything. Waddy Fayez Al-Fayumi was in 1st grade. He liked to play. He was learning to read. He was the kind of child who made a room feel different just by being in it. He was 6 years old. And on the night of October 14th, 2023, he was stabbed 26 times inside the home where his family had been renting a room. Not by a stranger who broke in through a window. Not by someone who had never looked his mother in the eye. By the man who collected their rent. By the man who lived on the same property. By the man who before that night had been trusted. His name was Joseph Czuba. This is what happened. This is all of it. October in Illinois carries a particular kind of quiet. The summer heat is gone. The leaves have started to turn. The days grow short quickly, and the darkness that fills the evenings comes early and stays late. In the small community of Plainfield Township in Will County, the world that Saturday was unremarkable. Neighbors were watching football. Families were finishing dinner. Children were getting ready for bed. Hanan Shaheen was one of those mothers. She was a Palestinian-American woman. She was in her early 40s. She had built a life in Illinois with her son Waddy, and she had rented a room in a house on the property of a man named Joseph Czuba, who was 71 years old and who had until recently been a decent enough landlord. Until recently, because something had shifted in the weeks before October 14th. Something in the relationship between Hanan and her landlord had cracked. And that crack ran along a fault line that had nothing to do with rent or plumbing or noise complaints. It ran along religion, along ethnicity, along fear dressed up as hatred. But on the evening of October 14th, Hanan did not know yet how far that fault line would break. She was with Waddy. He was 6. He had school on Monday. He had a life that spread out in front of him in every direction, full of years he had not yet lived. Hanan was his mother. She was keeping him safe. That was the job. That was the only job. She had no reason to believe the night would end the way it did. And that is the cruelest part of all of this. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what had been building for weeks before it. The conflict between Joseph Czuba and his tenant did not arrive out of nowhere. According to testimony and records from the investigation, the tension began escalating in the weeks following the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas conflict in early October 2023. That conflict was dominating international news. It was filling social media. It was making people afraid, and it was making some people angry in ways that had nowhere healthy to go. Joseph Czuba had been following the news. He had formed opinions, and those opinions, investigators would later establish, had attached themselves to Hanan Shaheen. Not because of anything she had done, not because of any argument between them about the property or about money, but because she was Muslim, because she was Palestinian, because she was the thing that Joseph Czuba had decided in his 71 years of living to hate. He had reportedly told Hanan that he needed her to leave, to take Waddy and go. Not because the lease was up, not because of any legal cause, because of who she was. Hanan did not leave. She had no reason to leave on demand. She had rights. She had a home. She had a child who was sleeping in that home. And that refusal, that completely reasonable and legal decision not to simply disappear because a landlord had decided she was the wrong kind of person, was the moment Joseph Czuba chose to escalate. There were other options available to him. He could have called a lawyer. He could have walked away. He could have done nothing. He chose none of those things. On the evening of October 14th, 2023, Joseph Czuba picked up a knife. He walked toward the part of the house where Hanan and Waddy were. Everything that follows is the result of that single decision. This part is short. It happened fast. It will not be made into something it was not. Joseph Czuba entered the space where Waddy Al-Fayumi was. The child was 6 years old. He attacked him. 26 times investigators would count. 26 separate wounds on a body that weighed less than 50 pounds. Hanan Shaheen was also attacked. She suffered multiple stab wounds as well. Slashing wounds, wounds that required emergency medical care. Wounds that she survived. Waddy did not. The attack happened quickly. Violence of that kind usually does. The mind does not process it in real time. The body does not understand, and by the time Hanan could react, could scream, could run, the damage was already done. She ran. She went to the only place she could find. She locked herself in the bathroom. She was bleeding. She was in shock. She was a mother who had just watched something happen that no language has ever been adequate to describe. She was also still alive, and that means she could call for help. She did. The 911 call came in and the clock started running. After the attack, the scene at the property fractured into 3 separate stories unfolding at the same time. Wadi was in the bedroom, unconscious, 26 stab wounds. Hanan was in the bathroom, bleeding, terrified, calling for help. And Joseph Czuba was outside. When officers arrived on scene responding to the emergency call, they found him lying in the yard. He had a wound on his head. The details of exactly how that wound was sustained would later become part of the investigation. But here's what mattered to responding officers. In those first seconds, there was a woman in the house screaming. There was a child who was not responding. And there was a 71-year-old man lying on the ground outside. Officers moved fast. The body cam footage from that night captures everything in the way that body cam footage always does. It is imperfect. It is tilted. The audio crackles. Officers breathe hard. Voices overlap. But through all of that chaos, you can hear something that silences every room it has ever been played in. You can hear the moment officers enter the bedroom. There is no dramatic music to accompany this in real life. There is no narrator explaining what is happening. There is just the sound of officers moving and then stopping, and the specific kind of silence that falls over a group of trained professionals who have suddenly encountered something they were not fully prepared for. Even with training, even with years on the job, even knowing what a crime scene looks like, Wadi Al-Fayumi stopped them in their tracks. Paramedics were called immediately. Emergency services worked on both Wadi and Hanan at the scene. Hanan was conscious. She was speaking. She was telling officers what had happened, even through her injuries, even through whatever state of mind a person occupies when they have just survived an attack that killed their child. She told them who did it. She told them why. And she told them that the man who did it was outside lying in the yard where officers had already found him. Joseph Czuba was transported to the hospital for his head wound. He was placed under police supervision. He was not going anywhere. The scene was secured. The investigation had begun. The interrogation room is a specific kind of place. It is designed to feel uncomfortable. The chairs are hard. The lighting is fluorescent and flat. The walls are close. There is usually a table with nothing on it except the weight of whatever is about to be said. When investigators brought Joseph Czuba into that room, he had already received medical care for the wound on his head. He was physically stable. Cognitively, he was present enough to speak, present enough to answer questions. Investigators started where they always start, slowly, establishing the facts they already know, letting the subject hear his own account, watching for the places where that account bends. They asked about Hanan and Wadi. They asked about the evening. They asked about the knife. The footage from this interrogation, portions of which became part of the evidentiary record in the case, reveals a man who understood the severity of what he was facing, but who had not yet fully calibrated how much investigators already knew. That is always the moment, that gap between what a suspect believes the investigators know and what the investigators actually know. That gap is where cases are made. The investigators in this case were patient. They had Hanan's statement. They had the crime scene. They had the physical evidence from the bedroom. They had the body cam footage from responding officers. They had a timeline. What they needed from Joseph Czuba was what always matters most in a case like this: motive. Stated motive, not assumed, not inferred, stated in his own words. And as the interrogation moved forward, that is exactly what they began to get. What Czuba said in that room would shape everything that followed, from the charges against him to the verdict to the sentence. But it was not a full confession, not immediately, not all at once. The truth in that room came out the way truth usually comes out when someone is trying to hold it back. In pieces, in small surrenders, in moments where the logic of denial ran out. In the interrogation, Czuba did not deny being present. He could not. The physical evidence made that impossible. What he attempted, in the way that people in that room often attempt, was to control the narrative around his presence, to shape the story into something that might soften what the evidence showed. It did not work. Hanan's testimony was consistent. She told investigators that Czuba had demanded they leave the property because they were Muslim. She told them this had been ongoing. She told them about the escalation. She told them about the attack itself in as much detail as she was able to provide, while also being a woman who had been stabbed and who had just lost her son. Her account was specific, coherent, and corroborated at every point by the physical evidence. Czuba, in his own statements, could not explain the physical evidence in a way that supported any other version of events. What emerged from the interrogation, from the investigation, and ultimately from the trial was a picture that prosecutors would successfully argue to a jury this was not a spontaneous act. This was not a moment of temporary insanity. This was a man who had made a decision informed by hate, executed with a weapon against a woman and her 6-year-old child. The child who died had done nothing, had said nothing, had been no threat to anyone. He was 6 years old. He was asleep, or nearly asleep, in the room where his mother thought he was safe. And Joseph Czuba walked into that room and stabbed him 26 times. When confronted with the forensic details, with the number of wounds, with the character of the attack, Czuba had no adequate response. The interrogation record shows moments of deflection, moments of attempted minimization, moments where the full weight of what was being laid out before him seemed to land and he had nothing left to offer. That silence, that collapse of alternative narrative was itself a form of confession. Prosecutors would use it well. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Will County Sheriff's Office. From the beginning, investigators treated this as what the evidence suggested: it was a hate crime. A murder committed not in the heat of a personal dispute, but in the cold grip of ideological hatred. That distinction matters enormously, both legally and morally. A hate crime under Illinois law and federal law is not simply a crime that involves bad feelings between two people. It is a crime motivated by the victim's membership in a protected group, whether that group is defined by race, religion, national origin, or other characteristics. It carries enhanced penalties precisely because the harm extends beyond the individual victim. It sends a message to every person who shares that victim's identity. When a 6-year-old Muslim boy is stabbed to death by his landlord because the landlord does not want Muslims on his property, that is not just the murder of one child. It is a message sent to every Muslim child, to every Muslim family, to every person of Palestinian descent living in the United States. Investigators understood this from the beginning. They gathered the physical evidence from the crime scene, the knife or knife-like instrument used in the attack, the bloodstain patterns, the forensic documentation of Wadi's wounds and Hanan's wounds. They documented the bedroom, the bed, the arrangement of the room, the position in which Wadi was found. They pulled records of the rental arrangement, communications between Hanan and Czuba, any written or digital record of the escalating conflict. They interviewed neighbors. They pulled whatever surveillance footage existed in the area. They built a timeline that accounted for every minute of the relevant evening. They took Hanan's statement in full multiple times as her medical condition allowed. Her account remained consistent. It was the account of a woman telling the truth. And they built the case from the evidence outward, not from the conclusion backward. That is how it is supposed to work. And in this case, it worked. The evidence was substantial. The motive was documented. The perpetrator was known, was in custody, and had been present at the scene. Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow announced that Joseph Czuba would be charged with first-degree murder for the death of Wadi al-Fayumi and with attempted first-degree murder for the attack on Hanan Shaheen. The hate crime designation was added to both counts, elevating the severity of the charges. Czuba was 71 years old. He had no significant prior criminal history. He was, by most external measures, what is often described as an ordinary person. And that in its own terrible way is the most important part of this story. The trial of Joseph Czuba moved through the courts of Will County with the kind of weight that comes when everyone involved understands they are participating in something historic. This was not just a murder trial. This was one of the most high-profile hate crime prosecutions in the state of Illinois in years. It was being watched nationally. It was being watched internationally. Hanan's community, the Palestinian American community, the Muslim community in the United States, and countless others who understood exactly what was at stake were following every development. Prosecutors presented their case methodically. The physical evidence, the forensic evidence, the testimony of first responders, the body cam footage, the records of the escalating conflict between Czuba and Hanan herself, who took the stand to describe in her own voice and in her own words what happened on October 14th, 2023. She described the demand to leave. She described the escalation. She described the attack. She described finding Wadi. She described losing him. The defense attempted to challenge the hate crime enhancement, arguing about intent and motivation. It did not succeed. The jury deliberated. Then they came back. Joseph Czuba was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Wadi Fayez al-Fayyoumi. He was also found guilty of attempted first-degree murder for the attack on Hanan Shaheen. The hate crime enhancements were upheld on both counts. At sentencing, Judge Amy Bertani-Tomczak handed down a sentence of 53 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Joseph Czuba was 71 years old when he was sentenced. 53 years is not a number that requires elaborate analysis when the person receiving it is 71. It is, in practical terms, the rest of his natural life. He appealed. The legal process continued to move. And then within 3 months of his sentencing, Joseph Czuba died in custody. He died in a state facility under the care of the Illinois Department of Corrections of causes related to his age and health. For those who had followed the case, for those who had loved Wadi, for those who had supported Hanan through everything, the news of his death landed in complicated ways. There was no additional suffering on his part, no drawn-out years of incarceration, no slow reckoning. He was gone, and Wadi was still gone. And Hanan still wakes up every morning in the world that October 14th made. This is the part that requires the most care. Because when we talk about the psychology of what Joseph Czuba did, we are not talking about mental illness. We are not talking about a broken mind or a chemical imbalance or a traumatic history that explains the inexplicable. We are talking about something far more common, far more dangerous precisely because of how common it is. We are talking about radicalization through narrative. In the weeks before October 14th, 2023, the world was consuming a specific kind of news cycle. The outbreak of violent conflict in the Middle East as it was dominating every platform. Cable news, social media, YouTube, Facebook, all of it was flooded with imagery and language designed to provoke emotional responses, to create urgency, to make people feel they were part of something larger, that they needed to act on what they were feeling. For most people, that urgency had nowhere to go, except into arguments, into donations, into protests, into phone calls to representatives. For Joseph Czuba, it went somewhere else. What the interrogation footage reveals is a man who had constructed a logic, not a legal logic, not a coherent moral logic, but a personal internal logic that had been built from fear and reinforced by whatever he was consuming in those weeks. The logic went something like this. The conflict abroad was connected to the Muslim woman in his house. The danger he perceived in the news was a danger he had somehow located in Hanan Shaheen and in her 6-year-old son. The world as he understood it had reduced them to symbols of something he feared and hated. And once a person becomes a symbol rather than a person, what happens to them stops feeling like what happens to a person. This is dehumanization. It is not a clinical term used only in academic papers. It is a mechanism that operates at the dinner table. It operates in comment sections. It operates when people who would never describe themselves as dangerous allow their perception of other human beings to be shaped entirely by the worst possible framing. Joseph Czuba did not know Wadi al-Fayyoumi as a child. He knew him as a symbol, as a threat, as the small embodiment of something he had been told to hate. And that is why the number 26 matters in ways that go beyond the horror of the count itself. 26 is not the number of wounds inflicted in a moment of rage that got out of control. 26 is the number that belongs to sustained violence, to something that did not stop, to something that required a person to keep going past the point where any ordinary instinct would have intervened. That kind of sustained violence against a 6-year-old boy is not the product of a single bad moment. It is the product of a worldview that had been assembled over time, piece by piece, into something capable of this. Forensic psychologists who study hate crime perpetrators note a consistent pattern. The most extreme acts of hate-motivated violence are rarely committed by people who wake up one morning and decide to hate. They are committed by people who have spent extended periods in environments, whether physical communities or online communities, that normalized and intensified that hatred until violence became thinkable. The interrogation footage in its silences and its deflections, in the moments where Czuba seemed not fully able to account for the gap between the ordinary man he believed himself to be and the act he had committed, tells this story. He was not in his own mind a monster. He was a man who had convinced himself that what he did made sense. And that is far more frightening than a monster. Because monsters are rare, but ordinary people who allow themselves to be led into hatred are not rare at all. This part belongs to him. Not to the case, not to the verdict, not to the sentence. Tawadi Fayez Al-Fayumi. He was 6 years old. He was in first grade at a school in the Plainfield area of Will County, Illinois. He was Palestinian American. He was Muslim. He was a child who, by all accounts of those who knew him and loved him, was alive in the specific radiant way that 6-year-olds are alive when the world has not yet done anything to dim them. He liked to play. The details reported by those who knew his family speak of a boy who was curious, who was warm, who was the kind of child who would run towards you when you arrived rather than away. He was learning to read. He was learning to count. He was learning in the slow and wonderful way that children learn what the world was and how to be in it. He had not yet learned anything about hate. He was 6. His mother, Hanan, had brought him to this country because she was trying to build something for him. A life, a future, a place in the world that would hold him. She found an apartment, she found a school, she found a community, and she found a landlord who decided that she and her child were unwelcome because of who they were. Wadi never made that decision. He never held a political opinion. He never expressed a view on international conflict. He never did anything to Joseph Czuba except exist in the same space. He was 6. In the days after his death, his community held vigils. His name was spoken at mosques and at community centers across Illinois and across the country. His photograph, a small boy with dark hair and the expression that all small children carry in photographs, the slightly unposed look of someone not quite sure what the camera is for, circulated on social media until it reached millions of people who had never heard of Will County, Illinois. His name Wadi means calm in Arabic, peaceful, still water. He was 6 years old. He wanted to be alive. He deserved to be alive. And whatever else this story contains, whatever psychology and investigation and verdicts and sentences, that is the thing that must never be buried under the weight of everything else. A boy named Wadi existed in the world, and then he did not, and the world is smaller for it. Cases like this one are described in the media and in courtrooms and in political speeches as shocking. And they are shocking. This one is. A 6-year-old boy, 26 stab wounds, a motive rooted in religious hatred. That is shocking. But there is something dangerous in stopping at shock, because shock implies surprise. And the murder of Wadi Al-Fayumi, as uniquely devastating as it was, did not arrive from nowhere. In 2023, according to data from the Council on American Islamic Relations, anti-Muslim bias incidents in the United States reached some of the highest levels recorded in recent years. That trend intensified in the final months of 2023 in the wake of the Middle East conflict. Jewish communities experienced similar surges in reported incidents. Arab American communities, Palestinian American communities, communities defined by religion or ethnicity or national origin, were seeing in real numbers the consequences of a cultural moment that had normalized certain kinds of hatred. Most of that hatred did not end the way October 14th ended, but it lived in the same ecosystem. Joseph Czuba was 71 years old. He had lived his whole life without committing an act of violence of this magnitude. He was retired. He was a landlord. He was, in the way the word is commonly used, ordinary. Something changed him. Something got into his mind and rewrote the way he saw the woman and the child living in his house. That something is not a mystery. It is not some psychological aberration that cannot be traced or named. It is the ordinary machinery of radicalization, the daily consumption of dehumanizing content, the construction of an us versus them worldview so totalizing that a child stops being a child and starts being a threat. This machinery is not operating in some distant extremist forum that most people never visit. It is operating on mainstream platforms, in comment sections, in family group chats, in the news feeds of people who consider themselves moderate and reasonable. The lesson of Wadi's death is not that we need to watch out for obviously dangerous people. The lesson is that the line between ordinary and dangerous is not a wall, it is a slope. And the slope is made of small things, of language that dehumanizes, of content that feeds fear and calls it information, of communities online and off that reward the intensification of hatred and punish the expression of complexity. There is another lesson here that belongs specifically to bystanders, to neighbors, to people who are aware of escalating hostility in their vicinity and who calculate that it is not their problem to address. The weeks before October 14th were not invisible. The escalating conflict between Czuba and Hanena was not happening in complete privacy. People around them knew something was wrong. Intervention is not always possible. It is not always safe. There is no clean moral demand that bystanders put themselves in danger. But awareness matters. Reporting matters. Taking seriously the statement, "I want you to leave because of your religion," as a warning sign of something that could become more than words that matters. Hanan Shahin survived. She survived to testify. She survived to speak her son's name in a courtroom. She survived to carry him forward into a world that took him from her. That survival is not small. It is the thing that allowed this story to be told with her voice in it. But survival should not have been the challenge she faced that night. She should have been safe in her home. Wadi should have been asleep in his bed. And we, all of us who consume news and share content and participate in public discourse, are not passive observers of the conditions that made October 14th possible. We are participants. What we do with that fact is the question the case of Wadi Al-Fayumi leaves behind. Joseph Czuba is dead. He died in an Illinois state facility within 3 months of being sentenced to 53 years for what he did to Wadi Al-Fayumi and to Hanan Shahin. He lived 71 years. He spent the last months of his life as a convicted murderer. He spent them with the knowledge, whatever comfort or torment, that knowledge brought him of what he had done. The law found him, the verdict found him, and then he was gone. The legal story has an ending. The human story does not. Hanan Shahin is still alive. She still gets up every morning. She still carries the weight of a night that no mother should ever have to carry. She has spoken publicly with a courage that is difficult to comprehend from the outside about Wadi, about his life, about her love for him, about her refusal to let him be remembered only as a victim of the worst thing that ever happened to him. She wants you to know his name, Wadi Faiz Al-Fayumi, 6 years old, first grade, a child who liked to play and was learning to read and had a whole life ahead of him that was taken away because a man decided that who they were was more important than who they actually were. There is a question that does not have an easy answer, and it is the question this case forces onto anyone who thinks about it long enough. The question is not whether hate crime laws are sufficient. They are not, and this case does not prove otherwise. The question is not whether the criminal justice system can repair what happened. It cannot. The question is this: at what point and in what small or large way did you and I and everyone else who participates in the information ecosystem of the 21st century contribute to the conditions that made it possible for a 71-year-old man to walk into a room and stab a 6-year-old boy 26 times? That question is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be. Wadi does not get to be uncomfortable anymore. He is at rest. He is in the Arabic meaning of his name, calm, peaceful, still. We are not at rest. We are still here. And that means we still have the one thing that Wadi no longer has: the ability to do something different. Use it. Say his name, Wadi Faiz Al-Fayumi. He was 6 years old, and he deserved every year he did not get.